15 minutes to capture what is I think, a very complex topic. My emphasis is very much on the words translation, how we take this body of knowledge, these experiences, these warnings, these deep analyses and dialogues that we've had for over 30 years, and we continue to work with them in ways that are deeply practical so that we are able to act in different ways in a context of these dramatic climate shifts that we are experiencing, and particularly in terms of the relationship between climate and food. So my presentation essentially hinges on 4 points. The first is that there is a very, very clear interconnection between food systems and climate change. And part of that is to try and build a resilient system that really acknowledges those interactions. We're very clear that climate is negatively affecting food security in South Africa and in the region, and that this is growing. And in places like eThekwini, a massive metro in KwaZulu-Natal's coast, is very, very important in terms of the food provisioning for literally millions of people. There are strategies that are in place. Many of them are merging or under review, but quite frankly, many of them are paper tigers. They exist as frameworks, as directives, as perhaps documents that sit on people's desks, and what they lack is often the capabilities, the wherewithal to be able to implement them and operate in ways that are really interesting and important. So just to step back, we already know that our system, our food system, has been affected by rising temperatures, which are disrupting food in many different ways in terms of shortages, failed crops. We're also experiencing it in terms of sudden weather events, such as flooding, for example, where, for example, massive areas of production come under impact, but also the logistical frameworks in terms of moving food, which is essential in places like eThekwini. With a partnership that's emerged over some years with Seriti, the SA Food Lab, and working with others like the Reels Institute, ICLEI, a range of other partners in eThekwini, we've been working with the city to try and understand how best to respond that is a little bit out of the ordinary in terms of acknowledging and responding to climate. At the moment, there is a eThekwini food resilience strategy that is underway. There is also a resilience strategy that is also under review. These two frameworks are providing us with this incredible opportunity to rethink how institutions are set up within the city in terms of the way units and divisions and sectors work together, but more importantly, how they work with non-state actors. Quite frankly, the state is not well set up to be able to engage this complexity. And we require partnerships that's not only in terms of people deeply embedded in practice, but also those that are thinking academically, strategically, or undertaking the research so that we are actively learning in those contexts. So let's look a little bit at eThekwini and the climate food impacts. I think the 2022 KZN floods are a superb example in terms of what happened within 24 hours, the 400 mils impact on massive spatial planning that has its legacy in deep apartheid, how this led to massive amount of infrastructure damage around roads, bridges, water infrastructure, supply chains being fractured, access to markets being limited. This was not an event that was out of the ordinary. Quite frankly, it is not unprecedented and very likely to become more a recurrent seasonal reality. More broadly in the hinterland, so looking then back into KwaZulu-Natal, but then further afield into places like Mpumalanga, Limpopo, even the Western Cape, which is a supply node in terms of staples and other fresh produce that's required for food security in the city. We've seen the impact of rising temperatures, compounding water stress, pushing crop and livestock systems towards their limits. So we've seen production cycles beginning to be disrupted. We've seen soil health diminish. And this again is that reality that then impacts the supply and flow of food into eThekwini in terms of other spaces, recognizing that the city by any means cannot think about producing its own food for the population. All of these things, as we recognize, have a direct impact on food price inflation and ultimately the insecurity. So we see the volatility play out in terms of shortages in some instances, reduced affordability, because not only is that impact on people's lives, livelihoods, but also on general employment opportunities in one of the biggest node catchments in terms of employment in the province. And so we're seeing weakening household resilience and a limited adaptive capacity in terms of being able to respond to that. This is what the science is telling us. We see this in terms of the evidence. Very clearly, the city and those driving the city need to be acknowledging these relationships and this complexity in order to be able to respond. So what are we learning in terms of our processes? As I said, I don't think policies and strategies are good enough. Workshops, meetings, even the well-minuted dialogues that happen through the mayoral office don't transform the systems, but they can create the conditions for change. So is there, for example, enough of a shared language and understanding, a set of stronger relationships and greater confidence to work in ways that are actually strategic rather than silo-orientated? So 4 key lessons that have emerged from our work. Adaptive governance is a practice, not a structure. So yes, the food resilience strategy is superb in terms of what it offers in terms of an institutional framework. Certainly the National Food Security and Nutrition Policy is miles ahead of what was evaluated as being certainly particularly weak in the last 5-10 years in terms of what it is suggesting in terms of governance. But it's much more than having those structures embedded on papers. Adaptability lives in how institutions learn, sense change, and respond over time. So in other words, do we have responsive governance that is embedded within human relationships as opposed to structures that are just being minuted in terms of meetings? Here, those interactions is about building trust, openness, and shared curiosity. So the processes that we've been leading and helping to facilitate are very much about officials coming together in very different experiences and building relationships that are right outside of perhaps their reporting structures. As they're beginning to work together, so their confidence on their own diagnosis and analysis of the situation emerges, but also the trust in terms of being able to work with others. Here, my main point. The capabilities matter as much, if not more so, than the plans. And here we've got to be thinking about systems thinking, about bridging capacities, about connecting the science, the policy, and the lived experiences of people who are living in Durban, in eThekwini, in terms of what can happen that is practical and will have a result. Finally, our argument about uncertainty needing to be navigated, not eliminated. So having a risk analysis that says we have these certain challenges that we've identified, we need to sidestep these or eliminate them is misplaced. We are seeing challenges and uncertainty emerging and compounding and changing daily. And so the key here is to have the confidence in terms of being able to adjust as conditions evolve. So the work that we've been doing is focused on those 2 strategies, the food resilience strategy and increasingly around the eThekwini resilience strategy that is now having a new leadership. And we've been able to raise funds from the Cambridge Mastercard Foundation in the UK to work with scholars within South Africa, but also drawing from a scholarship from East and West Africa that will be connecting with city officials over a long period of time to build learning experiences. So in other words, what is it to build resilience in terms of a food climate nexus? What does that look like? What can we garner in terms of the experiences of West and East Africa? How can these things shape our responses? How do we take a framework and adjust it so that it becomes a reality in terms of those relationships of trust that people have? So these are embedded in much bigger processes, as I said, the strategies that are emerging at the eThekwini level, but also they're intended and designed to feed upwards also to the national policy, which is now under review. So this work continues in terms of focusing on the capability, not so much on the strategies and the policy frameworks, but ultimately trying to look at new ways of working that ultimately can help us do with the reality of eThekwini in a context of massive climate shocks and the relationship between food and a future climate. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Scott. That was very insightful. We're gonna open the floor for questions if there are any questions. So I would welcome everyone to just raise their hands and introduce yourself and just the name and then pop in your question. Kamena, you can go ahead.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Brilliant. Scott, thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation. It was succinct, but it really hit a lot of points. And what's interesting, I don't come from the food sector. I come from the ECD sector. And everything that you spoke about in terms of lessons learned and working in a systems approach is applicable across many other sectors. And so I found that very interesting and agree with you entirely. What I wanted to ask you is in terms of resilience, community resilience, what are the kinds of indicators you would use to measure it from your perspective? Thanks.
Great. I appreciate that. So I'm going to hold on answering the question and just reflect on the ECD sector. So one of the key arguments that we raised with both the food resilience strategy and the resilience strategy colleagues is in terms of how are they working with the ECD sector. That this is absolutely key in terms of hitting so many of the opportunities in terms of linkages between nutrition, food, the future generation, and ultimately the opportunities to build much more resilient systems in terms of an existing sector. So I really do take what you say with a lot of gratitude and acknowledgement in terms of the ECD sector. So in terms of the indicators, so we've been working a great deal in the Nchanga area, in the outer west of eThekwini, and we witnessed that impact of the 22 floods in terms of how it devastated so many small cooperative farms, but also one home, one gardens. Those farmers that essentially were able to re-enter production very quickly, or those that, in their own words, were able to display some forms of resilience, were those that were operating in a much more holistic agroecological manner. So in other words, they were working very much with nature. So the indicators for us were those that had essentially transitioned towards agroecology or traditional farming, much more than those that were stuck in, for example, conventional agriculture with one or two crops. So those that were using much more diverse production systems were able to withstand not only the climate impact itself, so in other words, the runoff, the water, perhaps that devastation of the rain, but also in terms of their impact and losses weren't so severe because some things survived and others did not. Also, their ability to work with water harvesting, swales, water runnage, these things also meant that the impact itself on the production units were much, much less. So the use or the transition towards agroecological methods for us were absolutely key in terms of the Outer West, looking at farmers and producers. When it came to those that were living more in the formal and the informal areas in terms of the dense settlements, what was very, very striking was where there was this immense density, the damage and the impact was so much greater. Where people were living in settlements that weren't so dense, where there was much more opportunity for runoff, but also in terms of access, questions about the old incremental upgrading framework that was the vogue about 15 years ago, where communities were still living within those parameters, there seemed to be indicators of much greater resilience vis-a-vis settlements that were closer to water catchments runoff in much denser settlements. So those are two examples in terms of our witnessing in terms of resilience.
All right, thank you, Scott. Kimena, we hope your question has been answered. Let's take Lemogang Senna.
Good
Lemogang
morning.
Senna?
Yes. Yes. Am I audible now?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. My name is Lemogang Sinna. I promote South African writers and entrepreneurs on all sectors. My question today for the speaker, thank you so much, Ntate, for the insight. What you're saying is very pertinent to our present times, and would like to know how to take this information to schools, especially to our young ones in primary, for us to conscientize them as to our present time so that they also do not, fall behind as to the current talks. So that as and when they grow up, they're able to also see some of these things happening around them and also do whatever remedies that they may be able to implement as they're growing up. So is there a way of us perhaps partnering up and writing articles or even books about what you're talking about, just so that we can take it to the Department of Education? We've been dealing with mostly Gauteng Department of Education since 2018, 2019, and would gladly love to have some sort of a collaboration with yourself, if possible.
Lemogang, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I'm certainly open to engaging and writing exercises and indeed translation of some of these ideas into accessible formats, particularly for younger learners. There is an initiative that is co-facilitated by the Daily Maverick and also the School of Climate at Stellenbosch University that sees a journalist, a science writer, Leonie Joubert, who's been traveling around South Africa gathering stories of the reality of how people are adapting, are showing resilience in a context of a changing climate. Her stories, many of them are captured on the Daily Maverick website, but certainly are available in a number of other formats in terms of the stories of real experience, the stories of real resilience. Often we get overwhelmed by the negativity of what's surrounding us. And what she's been able to do is capture stories of hope and adaptation and resilience. And so I'd really draw you to speak with Leonie as well. And it's a connection I can help you make perhaps after this presentation. Emina, thank you very much for your comment as well. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Just note that we can't take all the questions at the moment. Just pop in your questions in the chat box, and we will share the presentations and Professor Scott's contact details so that we can take the conversation offline. With that being said, Sulofelo, just quickly drop in your question in the chat box, and we can move to our next speaker. It is now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Brian Mantlana. Dr. Mantlana is a climate and environmental scientist leading the climate change in air quality work at CSIR with experience across research and public policy. Dr. Mantlana, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Can I confirm that you can hear me?
We can hear you, Dr. Mantlana. You may go ahead.
Thank you. Again, a very good morning. I want to thank the Seriti Institute for inviting us to make an input this morning. Also, I'm happy that you've positioned my presentation after that of Scott. Scott, I liked your presentation a lot. You used some very useful terminologies there, systems thinking, climate shocks. There's a word that we used in passing that I liked, was trust. I find that I've been working at CSIR for about 8, 9 years now. And I find that one of the ways of making my work and the work of my team more impactful is trust building. So thank you, Scott, for that. My presentation is brief. I'm going to start by 2 slides showing what we do at CSIR in the context of climate change. Then I'm going to spend the rest of the talk talking about the substance of this morning, which is about building climate resilience. I now need to know how to take my slides forward. Okay. So I lead a team of about 34 researchers. Here I'm showing 2 research groups, but I work with 3 research groups. The third research group focuses on ocean science, so I left that part out for today. So there are 2 research groups that are directly relevant to the scope of work we are talking about today. One focuses on climate modeling and air quality modeling. That team is based here in Pretoria, and we we use models to look at projecting climate in the future. We look at seasonal changes. We also look at long-term changes like decadal, but we can also look at 2050 and 2100. So that team does work on early warning systems. For instance, we have flood modeling, flood early warning system. The other component of the same team, they look at modeling air quality. So there it looks at the interaction between air quality and human health. Then the second research group works on climate services. This group takes the outputs of the models from the climate modeling group and applies them in sectors like water, agriculture, biodiversity. So it's more of an applied field, applied science. This work, it contributes to designing and developing climate policies, understanding impacts, working on mitigation aspects, also the greenhouse gas emissions scope of work. So there's an element of our work that is looking at economics. We also try to understand the impacts of climate change on financials and economics. We also have of course, we've got a strong environmental footprint and socio-ecological issues. So that's basically the work that we do as a team. We do not do this work alone. We collaborate a lot with different role players. Now, coming to today's talk, I thought let me start with the first principles of who is facing the risk of climate impacts. We have in South Africa a situation where it's easy to say I am not impacted. My view is that everyone is facing climate risk. However, the exposure to this climate risk is different. It's different because of the inherent societal, socioeconomic structure of this country. People living in poverty are most exposed. Children, outdoor workers, those areas within the country that have weak governance. Scott put it politely in the first presentation. What did he say? He said something like, policies and strategies are not good enough to deal with the complexities of climate change. So governance is a key component of building climate resilience, but it's not the only component. Then I asked myself, why don't we have climate resilience? What are the challenges that make it hard for South African society to be climate resilient? And I've listed 5 of these. None of them is striking. none of them was, when I was preparing for this session, none of them was striking to me. It was something that I thought I would have thought about, although I got most of this from different gray literature. So I'm not going to walk through them because you can see my screen. But then I want to spend a bit of time here in characterizing building climate resilience. Firstly, I see climate resilience as not as an event, but as a process. I see it as a process that helps the translation, a word that Scott used, that helps the translation of policies into action. It helps to demonstrate the linkages between what we call climate actions and national priorities. We know the national priorities: jobs, poverty. So when one is working on building climate resilience, you then have an opportunity to demonstrate how climate action contributes directly to national priorities. It's working on enhancing climate resilience provides private sector and public sector opportunities to invest, to partner, to make a mark in societies. Most importantly for me is the last point that I've listed there, that when one is working on building climate resilience in the South African context, it is about contributing to development. And it makes climate action a development issue. I do not have enough time to explain what that means. But I just want to say, when you talk about climate change in Sweden and you talk about climate change in Swaziland, in my view, the context is so different that development for us in the global South becomes the center of that engagement. The last two slides are about reimagining climate resilience. Firstly, is the question of for whom? Climate resilience for whom? We may take it for granted that that question is answered, but I think it's important to bring it up front and be explicit of we are working on climate resilience for these beneficiaries. But in doing so, we need to be cognizant, we need to be aware that the people most affected by impacts of climate change may not necessarily have a common understanding of what the problems are as us. Second point there is that most of the time when people like myself and people that work in climate as I do, we put a lot of focus on economic indicators. We put a lot of focus on science of climate change, which is good because those give us proxies to understand what is happening and what could be done. But there is room for more work on quantifying the priorities of lived experiences of the people that are affected by impacts of climate change. Put simply, it may be that we are scratching not where the itch is. And in doing so, then we use words of describing the problem that are not recognizable to the people whom we're trying to assist. I found a new English word for my rather low English vocabulary, which is inarticulacy. When I was trying to understand exactly what the message I'm sending with that third bullet point, that we need to be careful that we use the same language of the people that we are building, whose people that we're building climate resilience for. Part of that work came from a paper of my postdoc, Dr. Anisha Mawela, that she published in January this year. From that paper, this is my last slide. From that paper, I took 6 key factors that affect building effective climate resilience. If we want to contribute to enhance community resilience to climate impacts, what should be the building blocks? One is scale, both temporal and spatial. Be clear about what you are targeting. Scott's presentation, for example, was targeting eThekwini. So it bounds you, it increases your focus if you are clear on scales. Clarity on beneficiaries, the question of for whom, climate resilience for whom. Understanding the governance, how decisions are taken. Understanding the governance. Governance is not government. Government is part of governance. So it's important that when one is pursuing building climate resilience, one makes oneself clear. You become familiar with the governance of how to translate that which you found into real action. The fourth point, I like it a lot. It's about avoiding treating issues as single issues. Professor Scott had a more useful word, which he said, a systems approach. But we tend to, mostly because of our training, we tend to treat issues as single issues. And climate change is not, when responding to impacts of climate change, treating issues as single issues is less than helpful. Fifth point is about understanding the context of vulnerability. People in Polokwane are vulnerable to climate change, but the context of their vulnerability is different to the people in eThekwini. There will be similarities, but there will be unique characteristics of the context of vulnerabilities. And this is an incredibly important component of that needs to be addressed when one intends to enhance community climate resilience. And lastly, this is true for us who spend our time in research, is understanding your identity. When you walk in the room and you are a researcher and you are coming to a community in a village in Liphalale, you must be aware of the power dynamics. Equally, if you walk into the cabinet meeting and you're going to address the cabinet on climate change, you must be aware of the power dynamics. So, this idea of being inclusive is important, but it's also important to know that the role players are not equal. And as a person who is pursuing enhancing climate resilience, we should not lose sight of the inequitable stakeholder participation and recognition. Thank you a lot for this opportunity to present, and thank you for the invitation. Those are my contact details. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mantlana, for such an insightful presentation. I think your reflections on reimagining the future of climate change and the importance around it, and the people that are most affected by this really highlight the need of an inclusive and forward-looking approaches. I think with that being said, we will now take the questions. If anyone has questions, just quickly raise your hand. The questions that are directed to Dr. Mantlana. Thank you. Lulu.
Good day, everyone. Thank you for the presentations. I think I enjoyed the first presentation and the second presentation. I've worked in various spaces in terms of sustainability, agroecology, amanzi for food, and quite recently I've moved into industry and jet, and predominantly the skilling space. And for both of the presenters, I'd like for them to speak to the jobs, right? Because the buy-in from industry and different sectors will be predicated, where are the jobs, as we try to diversify the energy mix. And if we're saying agroecology is the space in which we benchmark some aspects of food security and climate resilience, adaptation, and household security, what does that look like in terms of jobs? And how are we chartering that pathway and transition? We have various programs that we've done, but I think collectively the space has yet to really ground the job question for youth to integrate. I know a friend of mine is working with UNICEF right now on that SADC program on jobs, and there the biggest thing that is happening there is the micro-credentialism and using that as a pathway. But if the markets are not responding to that, those micro-credentials actually, not meaning to put it in a crude way, fails to have meaning or significance. And so the jobs, where are the jobs, and how do we define it as a community of practice, and how do we actually locate it as the climate resilience movement in South Africa is really starting to pick up steam.
Brian?
Yeah, I'll be brief. And thank you, Lulu, for pointing us to that issue of jobs. At the heart of building climate resilience is the issue of livelihoods. How one does that. Scott mentioned about some of the activities that he's working on. In my area, I'll use just two examples because of time. Firstly, it's important that funders in the last 4 or 5 years have been explicit to require clarity on how would that project affect livelihoods in the form of jobs created in the process of implementing that project. So there is an awareness from the funding side that the issue of jobs must be part and parcel of building climate resilience. So in my work, we do a lot. We have a number of options of how to do this depending on the scope of work that we are doing. If it is JET or if it is about transfrontier conservation, we have different ways we're involved in carbon markets, but there are many ways where jobs become the theory of change of our proposals. Secondly, on jobs is the need to partner with private sector. I have found from my experience that when we're implementing a project and we have private sector involvement, it's easy to build in a livelihoods line in that budget, in that project budget, where we deal with skills, we deal with capabilities, and talk about how those translate to actual jobs. So those are the 2 points for me. It's partnerships, but also is the funders, because the funders drive behavior. And now the funders are insisting on jobs as part of the requirements. And I see that coming through quite frequently these days. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Brian. I will take there's another question, but that's directed to Scott. I think we will just keep it that in the chat and then allow our next speaker to have a chance. Just one more question to you, Brian, before we allow our next speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Brian. What was very interesting in your presentation is how you spoke of insufficient community buy-in, and you know how climate change sometimes can be viewed as an abstract in communities. So my question is, how would one go about facilitating community buy-ins?
That's a $65,000 question. There is no single way of dealing with communities, precisely because the contexts are different. The principle is, and the experience shows that community buy-in is not necessary only for the success of the project, but also for the life of the project beyond the project lifetime. So it is a central cog that needs to happen. How to do it, which is your question. There will be different ways of doing it. The way you interact with people in Ekhayelitsha and the way you interact with people as Sentin would be different. As long as you've got their buy-in. So it's different. I'll give you one example of way back when I was starting to work on climate change about 25 years ago. We had a Kuyasa project in Cape Town where we were installing solar geysers. And the African community there was skeptical of why are these things brought to us? Why don't we see them in Newlands? Why don't we see them in Stellenbosch? This was before the era of load shedding and moving to solar PVs. And it was difficult to upscale that project for many years because communities we struggled to message the significance of what we're doing. So there I'm just giving a single example of this necessity of, no matter how good it is, the solution we are bringing, without community buy-in, you struggle to scale up the impact of your work. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Brian, thank you so much. We are running a bit out of time. If we have questions, let's just drop them in the chat box. So now we move to our final speaker, Rahul Gandhi. So Rahul Gandhi is an associate researcher at the University of Wits, focusing on the intersection between climate and inequality. I'm going to give Rahul an opportunity to just give us his insights in terms of the knowledge around climate change. Rahul, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I will try and be as brief as possible. Okay, is everything visible and audible? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. First of all, thank you to Seriti for inviting me to present here. And thank you to my fellow speakers for all the insights you've offered. I can't say that I have anything substantially different to offer in terms of thinking about climate knowledge and resilient communities. But what I want to present is some of the work that we've been doing at WITS and at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, particularly around climate knowledge and resilience. The first thing I'd like to present relates to some of the work that I'm involved in under the Pro Vice Chancellor at WITS for Climate Sustainability and Inequality. So the Pro Vice Chancellor is an office that was established. Sorry, I don't know why my slide is going ahead on its own. Which was established to have strategic oversight over areas of climate sustainability and inequality at the university. And as such, seeing the university as a community really becomes then important in terms of how do we translate our research and efforts on climate change into action. I want to highlight several activities that we're doing in the Pro Vice Chancellor's office that really try to translate this. And we have a variety of teaching and student engagements, but two key ones are the Climate Change and Me course, which is a course that is compulsory for all new undergraduate students to take. And that really stresses it covers a whole lot of knowledge about climate change, but stresses the importance of caring about climate change as well as the relevance for climate change across different faculties, so wherever students are coming from. So this is a really important program in terms of how it inducts students wherever they may be in whatever program, be that medicine, computer science, etc., into caring about climate change and hopefully thus having a broader societal impact. We're doing the same thing with the Climate Change and Us course, which is a course we are now introducing for all academic and professional staff at the university, with the same goals in mind. In addition to that, we have a fortnightly newsletter which we send out to quite a large number of people, both internally at the university and outside. And this is really to facilitate the conversations about what's going on in climate change, what events are happening, what opportunities are out there, what is the latest research, and so on. I would also stress that at the same time, in terms of these education advocacy elements, we also have this focus on internal governance and having strategic oversight over how is the university meeting its goals to address climate change. And this includes tracing and making improvements to things like waste management, to installation of photovoltaic power systems, introducing solar water heating, refurbishing boreholes, and ensuring sustainable use of water resources on campus. Those are just some of the activities. I'd now like to turn to a specific project at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, which really, where a lot of us at the center, we work in the Pro Vice Chancellor's office, but we also conduct research. And this research is really about conceiving of a nexus between care and climate change. This framework that I'm presenting here, and I'll go through it very briefly, has been developed by my colleagues at the center, Sonia Palazze, Julia Taylor, and Professor Imran Balodia, who is the Pro Vice Chancellor. And really, what it's trying to do is recognizing that climate change threatens food security and sovereignty, water availability, health, and livelihoods. Yet often it is women who bear the primary responsibility of unpaid care work, such as providing food, collecting water, and caring for the young, ill, and elderly. These activities are vital for life and social reproduction. And as such, we have a crisis of care at the same time as the climate crisis, where this unpaid care work is pushed onto women and girls. So climate change is going to disproportionately affect women and girls by increasing these responsibilities. Yet what the framework is trying to do is structurally understand that both crises of climate change and care are rooted in a system which undervalues care, women, and nature. And the framework tries to show that with on the left-hand side in the orange box, structural conditions around power and policies which really shape social, economic, and political inequalities. And then on the right, intermediate determinants, which really actually drive climate change, but are informed by these structural determinants which actually undervalue care and nature. So these links should we believe lead to these conceptual links should lead to more policy and practice. We know that women in our communities are disproportionately shouldering the responsibilities of care, but we need to recognize that climate change will increase this, and thus climate policy should not only focus on mitigation, but efforts at funding for adaptation which alleviate these responsibilities. And we need to start thinking about, on a community level, on a state level, how do we respect and pay for care work? How do we recognize care work? How do we reduce the burdens of care work? How do we redistribute the responsibilities of care work? How do we represent the efforts and the contributions that are made towards providing care work, and how do we actually remunerate this? Finally, I'd like to close by reflecting on a recent project that we're going about doing in collaboration with Aga Khan University in Kenya. This is called the African Care and Climate Innovation Alliance. We have evidence of the crisis of care. This comes from feminist economics. We also have evidence of climate change. But what we're trying to do here is bring these together to provide evidence of this care-climate nexus, which I've described. We're using several household surveys in the Bushbuck Ridge area, and these go back to at least 1992, with some more recent surveys since 2010 being focused on socio-ecological systems of people there. But what we also want to do is get additional insights into how are people actually experiencing this crisis of care and climate change. We want to have surveys looking at how much time has been spent on care, and has climate change actually increased the time that has been spent. We also want to have focus groups to understand what are people's perceptions of care. And thus, can we actually see that care for both humans and the environment is being affected by climate change? I'd finally like to reflect on what does this all mean? I think I've spoken about certain things like recognizing care, remunerating care, redistributing care, but we also need vital infrastructure to make care work easier. We need infrastructure that ensures that if climate change is increasing the responsibilities of care, such as collecting water, that infrastructure should support this. If climate change is increasing the care needed for people, then infrastructure in the form of care centers or childcare centers, for example, should support this. We should collectivize care through initiatives like communal food hubs, food gardens, childcare centers, as I mentioned, for instance. But vitally, these community interventions would need state support in the form of resources, state or private sector, any other sort of support. And we're trying to think through how can climate finance actually be directed towards these kinds of initiatives? Can we think of an idea perhaps of care credits where we direct climate finance towards care? Lastly, I would just talk about something in Uruguay called the National Integrated Care System. And this is quite an innovative system which really takes all these insights that conceptualize of the crisis of care and think about providing universal care. And they provide universal care through centers, as I've mentioned, but these are state supported, and they also provide formal jobs for people to work in these centers. So it's really a holistic thinking about development, care, and in our case, climate change. Thank you so much.
All right, Rahul. Thank you so much for your presentation. We do have a question. There's someone who raised their hand. If they can just quickly ask the question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. My name is Elizabeth Mukotong. I'm based in Pretoria and involved in issues of climate change and agroecology and the South African women in agroecology and others. I'm sort of like saying, yeah, I enjoyed all the presentations and congratulations, Seriti. I was talking about you yesterday at some meeting and saying you are an important stakeholder in these development issues. My question is on all the presentation. I think coming from the ground and being an activist in all this, I realize the communities are ready and they are experiencing the extreme problems related to climate change. But everybody here talks mainly about, you know, the processes of unpacking the concept. But for me, I always say we live in, unfortunately, a capitalist world. And that being the case, somehow we have left out research, solid research on, you know, penetrating the market in terms of influence, in terms of communities entering the market with their resilience strategies. For example, if you're doing work on agroecology, which I believe strongly in, agroecology is a labor-intensive job. It's a creative job. It's sort of like a movement that weaves people together. But then people will produce, and as you produce, you will definitely produce quality food. And the problem now comes in that, I can't penetrate the market. Even if I'm selling my bunch of beetroot, which is nice and healthy and promote life and so on, I can't compete with the insecticide-packed carrot that is on the shelves of ShopRite and related business entities. So we need from the ground a lot of research on these livelihood stories. I will really appeal very strongly to say, how do we help communities to change the mindset? When I'm talking community here, I'm talking about the commercial community. I'm talking about the health-related community to really come to the party in terms of awareness. Like, for example, our food system mainly is sort of like something else. You have a food system that is sort of like captured by the big global business people. And agroecology, for example, it's like you have to compete at the local level with the convenience of somebody going to ShopRite and Checkers. So a lot of work is needed on the economic of climate change. For example, in agroecology, women will be planting and planting, but they can still benefit from the carbon credits. But there's nobody who says, if I'm planting in Hammanskraal, how do I work out a system where I can benefit from the carbon credits? And that brings money into communities and so on. It's like carbon credit in South Africa. Only the clever ones will be able to access those funds. So we are appealing to big organizations like our universities, and Seriti is coming up very strongly to say, please, we need a division on the economic impact of what we are doing of climate change, because for now, most of the people are being more and more marginalized, even if we do good things. If we have to do issues, for example, like recycling, it's the big guys who come in and benefit, and the smaller guys are just left out of the equation.
All
Yeah,
right,
all
thank you,
the nice,
Elizabeth.
yeah, thank you.
Elizabeth, yeah, we are running out of time, and I think Scott would be perfect to, answer the question. I think it's more related to, his line of expertise. And if there are no questions that are related to Rahul, Scott, do you mind jump in terms of answering Elizabeth Mukutum?
Yeah,
Yes,
sure. Yeah, so thank you,
Mokoto.
Elizabeth. I very, very much appreciate your reflection and talking very much around assets that exist within a community in terms of a commitment, but also access to land, and really just looking at those opportunities. And part of and I mentioned this earlier in the chat. So the national frameworks are definitely becoming more influenced by this move towards what some would call sustainable agriculture. Others would argue there's a continuum towards agroecology. And that continuum creates opportunities right throughout. And a lot of our concern is that in that we are not diminishing jobs to the benefit of the ecology, but rather that we are bringing all of these things together. And that's what agroecology offers. And the new agroecology framework really talks about the part of agroecology, which is about people, about organization, about linkages. And so, what the framework is going to try and do is create connections between communities like yours, such as in Pretoria or Shwani, with those in Bella Bella, for example, with the Mopani Farmers Association, which is a few hours away, with farmers in Mpumalanga that are at the Hoedspruit Hub that are engaged in agroecological production and process. And when we're creating those kinds of forums of interlinkages, so a movement is built, an agroecological movement where there's real traction and opportunities to learn. But also in that, markets appear, opportunities in the circular economy. And so really just to draw people's attention to this framework that's emerging, but to really emphasize it's not one or the other. We're on a continuum, a journey as we face climate and the food system and this interaction in a way then that sustains livelihoods and jobs and the ecology and the long-term future, as well as the food system in terms of our needs, in terms of access, utilization, and availability. So that's my direct response in a fairly high-level way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott. I hope your question is answered, Elizabeth, and thank you for raising that up. We do have a question for Rahul.
Hi, Rahul.
Hi.
Thanks for that presentation. I just want to
Sure.
say thank you so much. I just think in terms of the work you do, is there a comparison between kind of care related to what is it? The climate nexus in relation to South African context and in relation, I believe one of your partners, Kenya, and also in terms of climate change in what's been the overall change in behavior from like undergrads going through the course from where they were. Thanks.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so firstly, on the climate change and me course, I think it's difficult to assess really if there's any actual change in behavior, because there's no precise way of assessing that. But from what we've seen, I think there's been increased numbers of students who actually follow through on taking this course. It is compulsory to take, but it's not always compulsory to finish or to partake in all the sort of activities that are involved in there. But I think we've seen a larger uptake, and we actually had a session on Tuesday where we met with these students and we spoke to them, and there was such an eagerness to get involved and to think about what can they actually do. Including, getting involved on the food gardens we have on campus. So we have food gardens on which we champion agroecological principles, and these are run by volunteers. So it was great to see that these students who had taken this course see the importance of getting involved in initiatives like that. In terms of the care and climate nexus, I think the work really began as something quite conceptual, but it is being taken into South Africa. So as I mentioned, we have our Kenyan partners, but I won't really speak to that because I'm not sure of the details of where they're working and that sort of thing. But in South Africa, as I mentioned, we are looking at communities in Bushbuckridge in Mpumalanga. And here, this is a semi-arid region. There's a lot of migrants in this region. It's also quite rural, and as such, look, we want to use these surveys that have been done over many years in these areas to see what changes have occurred in those areas, particularly because these areas have been in Bushbuckridge have been hit by droughts over the years. They've also been and this has affected their livelihoods. So we want to see what relations these reveal about the care and climate nexus, particularly in that place. But I think we have further work to do. We these surveys, they ask questions about who lives in the household, what sort of resources people are reliant on in terms of their natural environment, like where do they get their food from? Crops? Do they get it from their families? Do they buy their food? And these reveal interesting relationships, but I think we really also want to talk to these people and get their insights into what is their understanding of how is the care that women and girls in these households have, what is the care responsibilities that they've experienced, and are these being affected by climate change? So that's further work for us to do. Thanks.